A body, a chair, and silence that speaks volumes. Welcome to Wired Script Den. I'm your host, Denora. I love seeing this community grow. Tell me where you're tuning in from today. Hearing from you makes this journey special. Let's begin. If you think life at the brownstone runs on surprises, you don't know Nero Wolfe. Surprises are weeds in his garden of routine, and Wolfe has no love for weeds. Our schedule is stitched tighter than Fritz's soufflés. Orchids at 9, lunch at 1, beer at 6, and woe to anyone who thinks they can wedge themselves between him and his chair. My own hours are flexible enough to accommodate the unexpected, but Wolfe guards his like a jealous sultan. So when the knock came at the front door a shade past 11 on a Tuesday morning, it landed in the category of mild annoyance, which is still several categories short of catastrophe. I opened the door to find a woman who wasn't quite what you'd call rattled, but she was working up to it. She was tall, with a coat too heavy for the season, and a pair of eyes that weren't in sync, the right one measuring me, the left one measuring something behind me. I gave her the once-over, decided she didn't carry either a badge or a bill, and stepped aside. "Mr. Wolfe is not receiving visitors at present," I said in my most apologetic tone, which is to say not very apologetic at all. "But you're welcome to state your case to me. I'm Archie Goodwin. I handle the details. I need to speak to him directly." She pressed her lips tight like a woman who'd rehearsed the line. "It's personal and urgent." That word urgent is one of Wolfe's least favorite. It implies hurrying, and he holds that hurrying is as bad for the nerves as weak beer is for the palate. Still, I've seen cases creep into our laps because some stubborn bird insisted on pushing past my polite roadblocks. I wasn't going to let her past, but I wasn't going to let her walk either. "Your name?" Clara Dane. That didn't ring any bells. She had the kind of face that could have sold hand lotion in glossy magazines, but there was grit under it. The kind that comes from swallowing more than your share of sharp words. "All right? Miss Dane, wait in the front room." I motioned toward the red leather chair, the one that's cushioned more stories than Wolfe would ever admit. She sat, clutching her bag like a lifeline. I went to the office where Wolfe was at his desk, a book in his hands, the morning sun and his 7 orchid hours behind him. He didn't look up when I entered. "A visitor," I said. "Name of Clara Dane. Says it's urgent, personal, and probably worth interrupting your piece for. Do you want me to tell her to take her personal urgency elsewhere?" Phoy. Wolfe's eyes stayed glued to the page. "Interruptions proliferate like mildew. I presume you failed to dispose of her yourself." I gave it a good shot. "She insists on you." That got him. He set down the book slowly, as if pages deserved a proper goodbye. His lips curved in that half scowl which passes for Wolfe's version of curiosity. "Very well. 10 minutes. Bring her." When Clara Dane stepped into the office, she paused like everyone does. The place has a way of putting strangers in their place. The desk like a fortress. Wolfe behind it like a monarch who forgot to abdicate. The rows of books, the orderly quiet. She perched on the edge of the red chair I offered, the bag still clamped to her knees. Wolfe gave her the look he usually reserves for trout that has been improperly cooked. "Your urgency, madam?" She swallowed once, twice. Then she said, "Mr. Wolfe, I'm afraid someone is trying to kill my father. Or if not kill him outright, destroy him piece by piece. And last night it nearly succeeded. The weapon was a chair. If you've lived with Wolfe long enough, you get used to the little signs." His eyelids flickered once, which is practically a drum roll in Wolfe language. "Archie Goodwin," I told myself. "You've just opened the door to something that won't be filed under routine. Would you like me to continue fleshing out this first section to about 1,500 words, building in Archie's observations, Clara's full story, and Wolfe's reluctant acceptance, or keep the opening tighter and move into section 2? The brownstone disturbed." Clara Dane sat there with her bag clenched so tightly, her knuckles looked like they were trying to bleach through her skin. I gave her credit. She wasn't trembling and her voice was steady enough when she said it. But the kind of woman who talks about death by furniture without a blink is either unhinged or cornered. Wolfe didn't move, but I caught that infinitesimal narrowing of his eyes again. For him, that was fireworks. "You said—" "A chair," he repeated, rolling the word like it might be spoiled milk. "You must elaborate, madam, or depart. I abhor riddles dressed as narratives." She licked her lips and loosened her grip on the bag. Out came a folded sheet of stationery, creased enough to show it had been read more than once. She didn't hand it to Wolfe. She passed it to me, probably figuring he was too important to sully himself with paper. Wolfe gave a grunt of approval. Delegation suited him fine. The note was typed unevenly, as if the machine were missing a couple teeth. It read, "You sit too long in the chair that cradles you. One day soon the cradle will snap. Consider this justice long owed." No signature, no date beyond yesterday's postmark uptown. Picturesque, I said, but hardly specific. A bad joke? Clara's eyes sharpened. It wasn't a joke when my father nearly didn't rise from his seat at the club last night. He was hosting a dinner. He leaned back, just leaned back the way he always does, and the chair collapsed. It didn't merely break. It was tampered with. The joints were sawed half through, so that the weight of him would finish the job. Your father is? Wolfe prompted. Raymond Dane. He owns Dane Importers, shipping, textiles, spices. He was respected once. In the last year, competitors have circled him like sharks. He's been in disputes, contracts challenged, accusations whispered. But nothing that should make him fear for his life. Her voice had softened at that last bit, as though she knew even as she said it that it wasn't true. Phooey, Wolfe said, his tone dismissive but not final. Sabotage of a chair is crude, effective only by fortune. A blow of chance is not murder. It is accident repurposed, unless you have reason to believe your father was selected deliberately. Her chin tilted up. The note, Mr. Wolfe, and the look on his face when he read it. He knew who it was meant from, even if he won't say. He won't go to the police. He said it was business, and that he would manage it himself. But I know my father. He is proud, too proud. He won't admit danger, even when it hovers above him like a blade. She pressed her lips again, and the silence filled with the ticking of the wall clock. I watched Wolfe. He was pretending disinterest, fiddling with the angle of his blotter. But I've seen him enough times to know when the hook was sliding in. The word spices had done it. Wolfe can pretend indifference to the human race, but seasonings are another matter. Dane Importers meant saffron, cinnamon, rare peppers, all the things Fritz babbles about when the pantry's flush. Wolfe asked, "And you, Miss Dane, what is it precisely you ask of me?" Her breath came out sharp. "I want you to find who sent that note, who tampered with the chair, who wants my father destroyed. He won't ask for help, so I am." Wolfe closed his eyes for a long moment, as though retreating to the safer landscape of his brain. Then he opened them and delivered his verdict. "Bah, you exaggerate. The police exist for this purpose. She straightened. "If I go to the police, my father will never forgive me. He'd call it betrayal. He insists on silence." "Then you should indulge him," Wolfe said, his tone flat as a stone. "Good day." I felt her flinch, and I admit even I winced. That's Wolfe at his iciest. Most folks would have gathered their belongings and dignity and left. But Clara Dane didn't. She stayed planted, chin higher, her bag on her lap like it weighed more than the room itself. "Mr. Wolfe," she said, very softly, "you may consider me impertinent, but I think you know you're already interested. If my father falls, it will ripple far beyond his chair. Dane Importers supplies half the city. I don't care about that, I care about him. But you might care if your cook finds he can't buy what he wants anymore." That was a dart, a bold one. I stole a glance at Wolfe. His mouth curved, not a smile but the shadow of one, the way he smiles at Fritz when the pâté is exactly right. He didn't admit it, but she had struck the one artery she needed. "Archie," he said finally, "obtain Mr. Dane's address. Tonight you will attend upon him. Report his disposition, the chair and any further eccentricities, and that was that." Clara Dane exhaled, as if she'd been holding her breath since the door opened. She scribbled the Park Avenue address on my notebook, thanked Wolfe with a nod that carried no triumph, only relief, and left. The door clicked shut behind her. Silence settled, except for Wolfe's sigh as he leaned back. He closed his eyes again, but I knew he wasn't resting. He was arranging the pieces on the board. I pocketed the note and said, "So you're in. Any particular reason besides saffron?" He cracked an eyelid. "Archie, a man's chair is his citadel. To strike at it is to strike at him. It is vulgar and it offends me. That is reason enough. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how a Tuesday at the Brownstone went from ordinary to urgent. Tonight, I was going to meet Raymond Dane, the man whose chair had almost cradled him into the grave. By 8 that evening, I was standing in the marble lobby of the Park Avenue building Clara Dane had scribbled on my pad. listening to the hum of an elevator that probably cost more than my yearly wardrobe allowance. The doorman, who had a face carved from granite and a tie sharp enough to slice bread, had already checked my name against a list. Clara must have warned her father I was coming, though whether he welcomed the news was another matter. The elevator opened into a foyer with black and white tiles that could have doubled as a chessboard. A man was waiting, grey suit, silver hair brushed back, and a frame still broad enough to make you think he'd been in the kind of business that required more than a handshake. Raymond Dane didn't smile when he shook my hand. He didn't frown either. He just sized me up like I was another crate of goods he had to appraise before shipment. "You're Wolfe's man," he said. His voice was gravel mixed with steel. "Clara was wrong to involve him." "This is family business," I shrugged. "If it's family business, then what am I doing here? Seems to me chairs collapsing under businessmen aren't usually solved around the dinner table." His eyes narrowed, but there was something tired in them. The chair was nothing. Old wood, weak joinery. People see conspiracies in splinters. Splinters don't type notes on bad machines and mail them, I said, handing him the sheet. He didn't take it, just glanced at it with disdain. "A prank," he waved it off. "The world is full of enemies when you've been at the top as long as I have. If I counted every threat sent to my office, I'd have died a dozen times by now. This was clumsy." "Forget it," he was bluffing. I'd seen the way Clara's jaw set when she told us about his reaction. A man may be proud enough to lie to himself, but daughters have a way of spotting cracks in the armor. "Let's humor me," I said, strolling toward the dining room. The table was long enough to seat a baseball team and the opposing manager. The chair at the head, still missing from its spot, had been replaced with a newer one, sturdy walnut with heavy legs. "This the famous throne?" He stiffened. The old chair was removed. "Broken, worthless. Or evidence," I countered. "Where is it now?" "In the basement, waiting to be hauled away. That was all I needed. I made a note to take a look later, but I didn't push him yet. Sometimes a man gives more away by trying too hard not to." I turned back to him. "Let me ask the obvious. Who'd benefit from seeing you out of that chair for good?" His laugh was short, bitter. "Pick a name from the trade registry. Every rival importer who's lost a contract. Every partner who thinks I've squeezed him. Every competitor who resents I've kept afloat while they sank. But none of them would stoop to carpentry sabotage." "Someone stooped," I said. "Any recent disputes?" "Deals that soured." His jaw worked, then he said, "There was a quarrel last month with Forbes Larkin. He accused me of undercutting him on a shipment of saffron. Lies, of course, but he's a vicious man. He thrives on grudges. There are others, but he is loudest. That gave me one name to chew on." I filed it away, along with the look in Dane's eyes when he said it. The kind of look that said he didn't fear Forbes Larkin. He despised him. Different flavor. Before I could ask more, Clara came in, still in her coat, her cheeks flushed from the cold. She greeted her father with a kiss that he accepted stiffly, then turned to me with a small nod. "I trust Mr. Wolfe has assigned you," she said. Something like that. "I'm here to see if your father's furniture is trying to kill him again." That earned me a sharp glance from Dane, but Clara smiled faintly. "Show him the chair, father, please." He muttered something about women conspiring against him, then led us downstairs. The basement was a storage warren of crates, barrels, and dust. In one corner, leaning like a corpse waiting for burial, was the chair. Its back was splintered, two legs jagged where the wood had given way. I crouched down, pulled a small penlight from my pocket, and ran it over the breaks. She hadn't been exaggerating. The cuts weren't from age. They were deliberate, sawed clean through, then smoothed to look worn. Whoever did it knew carpentry well enough to fake decay, but not well enough to erase the blade marks under light. I straightened. This wasn't splinters. This was work. Dane's face darkened, but he said nothing. Clara looked vindicated, though there was no joy in it. "All right," I said, dusting off my hands. "I'll take it from here. Mr. Wolfe will want more names. Rivals, enemies, old quarrels. The more the merrier. You can pretend you're safe, but I'll make sure you're not sitting blind." Dane's answer was a grunt, the kind of sound that meant he was done talking. Clara walked me back up and out, her voice low. "You see now, Mr. Goodwin, he'll never admit fear, but he's marked. Whoever wants him gone won't stop with one chair." "Don't worry," I told her. "Nero Wolfe doesn't need to stand up to fight back. He just sits and waits for people to hang themselves. And your father's enemy already picked out the rope. Back at the brownstone, I gave Wolfe the rundown. He listened, motionless, eyes closed, fingers interlaced across his middle. When I finished, he let out a long breath. Crude but deliberate, he murmured. An adversary with more passion than precision. Mr. Larkin may serve as our opening gambit. We shall draw him nearer. And with that, Wolfe signaled for the beer. I knew the case had officially settled into the brownstone, and whatever game was being played with chairs, threats, and pride was about to be staged on his terms. The next morning, Wolfe was already at his desk when I came down from my room, which meant either the orchids had behaved themselves early, or he was impatient to start steering the Dane matter. I handed him the list I'd compiled over breakfast: Forbes Larkin, the saffron squabble, Miriam Vale, a former partner who'd sued Dane 2 years ago and lost, Jerome Tully, who had once headed Dane Importer's finance division until he was shown the door under cloudy circumstances, and a fellow named Peter Dross, who ran a smaller importing house that had been losing bids to Dane for months. 4 names, 4 potential tempers sharp enough to reach for a saw. Wolfe scanned the list with a grunt, then set it down. "You will see them," he said. "Begin with Larkin. He is most obvious, therefore least likely. But obviousness has its uses. I didn't need convincing. If Larkin had a reputation for loud grudges, he'd either hand me a confession wrapped in insults or talk enough to point the finger elsewhere. I made the call and got myself an afternoon appointment at his office downtown. Forbes Larkin looked like the kind of man who would choke on his own tie knot just to prove he could outlast the cloth. Heavy-jawed, florid, and built like he'd been poured into his suit by a resentful tailor. He greeted me with a hand that felt like a slab of raw steak and an expression that told me charm was a foreign language. "So Wolfe sends his errand boy," he said. "What's he sniffing after this time? Or should I say who?" "That depends," I told him, settling into the chair opposite his desk. "On whether you've been spending your evenings playing carpenter with Raymond Dane's furniture." The look that crossed his face was equal parts amusement and scorn. "That pompous peacock? If he fell on his rear in front of his fancy friends, I'd pay to watch. But don't mistake pleasure for crime. I don't need to saw through wood when I can cut him down in courtrooms and boardrooms." "Funny thing," I said, leaning back. "He named you as the loudest of his enemies. Thought maybe you had the volume to back it up with action." Larkin's fist came down on the desk, rattling the pens. "I want Dane ruined, yes. He's crooked, undercutting bids, bribing shippers, squeezing the rest of us until we choke. But murder, please. I'd rather see him alive and bankrupt. Death lets a man escape the spectacle." It sounded rehearsed, but there was conviction in his eyes. He wanted Dane broken in daylight, not snuffed out in whispers. I filed him under likely to shout but not to soar, though I wasn't ready to cross him off entirely. Back at the brownstone, I delivered the interview to Wolfe. He listened, face blank except for the occasional twitch of his lips when I quoted Larkin's tirade. When I finished, he tapped the armrest with 2 fingers. "He is not exonerated," Wolfe said, "but he is not our craftsman." Next, Vale. "A woman who loses litigation may retain both bitterness and patience." That meant another trip, this time to a brownstone in the East 80s, where Miriam Vale ran what remained of her importing venture. She was sharp-faced, sharp-voiced, and sharp enough to know exactly why I was there before I said a word. "Raymond sent you, didn't he?" "Or no, Wolfe. Yes, I've heard about his methods. He hides in his house and lets others dig in the dirt." "Call it soil analysis," I suggested. "Did you ever think of sawing a chair leg to settle old scores?" She laughed, a bitter little sound. "If I wanted Dane dead, I'd sue him again until he drowned in his own paperwork. He's a parasite, but he's also his own worst enemy. He'll collapse without help. Why should I get my hands dirty when time will do it for me?" That sounded plausible but not airtight. Disdain can be a mask for desperation. Still, she didn't give off the scent of someone who had recently borrowed a saw. When I reported back, Wolfe was chewing on a different angle. "Archie, the tampering required access. The chair resided in a private club, did it not?" "Who there had opportunity?" That was a point I hadn't pressed. Dane's club, exclusive, marble-floored, the kind where members guard their reputations like crown jewels, wouldn't let just anyone in with a toolbox. Which meant either someone on the inside, or someone Dane trusted enough to invite. "Saul Panzer," Wolfe said, closing his eyes. "Engage him, quietly. He will observe Dane's movements, his associates at the club, the staff. If a chair was tampered with there, it will not be the only trace left." I made the call. Saul, dependable as a compass, agreed without fuss. With him on watch, we had eyes where Wolfe never deigned to tread. That evening, as Fritz laid out squab with herb sauce, Wolfe permitted himself a small reflection. The assault on Dane was symbolic as much as lethal. His chair, his seat of authority, was chosen to unseat him in more than one sense. It is not murder they seek, Archie, but humiliation that cripples. That is far more pernicious, I didn't argue. He was right. And if humiliation was the weapon, then someone out there wanted not only Dane's fall, but to watch him crash from his own height. The kind of enemy who wanted to break a man's back by first breaking his pride. 2 days later, Saul Panzer dropped by with his findings, and when Saul takes the trouble to step inside the brownstone rather than deliver by phone, you know the details are worth more than postage. He sat across from Wolfe, neat as always, and gave the report in the same measured tone he'd used to order breakfast. He'd shadowed Dane's visits to the club, confirmed the broken chair had been part of a set that rarely left the dining room, and narrowed down who had easy access. The club staff, 3 stewards, 2 porters, and a handyman named Elliot, were in and out constantly. Members left personal items, but rarely meddled with the furniture. Except, Saul added, one man, Jerome Tully. At that name, Wolfe opened his eyes, which he hadn't done for Saul's whole recital. Tully had been Dane's finance head until their bitter split. According to Saul, he now frequented the club almost daily, nursing resentment along with his whiskey. And 1 week before the chair collapsed, Saul had seen him in that very dining room after hours, talking to the handyman Elliot. The two had been standing by the line of chairs, and when Saul passed close, Tully had cut the conversation short. That was the kind of morsel Wolfe chews for hours. He dismissed Saul with thanks, then turned to me. Archie, arrange to see this Elliot. A handyman's tools leave marks. I want to know if his have been recently employed in the service of Mr. Tully's animus. I tracked Elliot down after some coaxing from the club steward. He was a wiry fellow with grease-stained hands, and the look of a man who would fix anything for a tip. When I mentioned the chair, his shoulders went tight. I just mend what breaks, he said, eyes shifting. Chairs give way, I patch them. Nothing more. Sure, I said. Except this one didn't just give way, it was helped along. Saw marks. You ever patch up cuts like that? His mouth opened and closed, then he tried a different tack. Tully's a member. He asked me once, hypothetically, what it would take for a chair to look sound but fail under weight. I laughed it off. A joke. That's all. Your jokes always come with sawdust? I asked. He didn't like that. He muttered something about minding his own work and bolted as soon as courtesy allowed. Back at the brownstone, I reported every twitch of Elliot's face. Wolfe leaned back, closed his eyes, and steepled his fingers. So, Tully sought demonstration. Elliot supplied the knowledge, perhaps more. A chair's betrayal at the dinner table is a finance man's revenge. Fitting symmetry. Except, I pointed out, Tully didn't send the note. Elliot doesn't strike me as a poet either. That's a second hand in the pie. Precisely, Wolfe said. There are 2 assaults, the physical on the chair, the psychological by letter. They may converge, or they may be distinct actors united in purpose. We must test the overlap. He instructed me to invite Jerome Tully to the brownstone under the pretense of discussing business reputations. When the man arrived the next afternoon, he was red-faced, suspicious, and already half-defensive. Wolfe let him sit in silence until the sweat started. Then he said, very calm, Mr. Tully, carpentry is not your trade. Yet you instruct craftsmen in its arts. Why? Tully bristled. I don't know what you mean. You mean you don't wish to explain why you advised a handyman how to weaken a chair? Wolfe corrected, his voice clipped. Phui, petulance is transparent. You resent Mr. Dane for your dismissal. That is clear. Did you also seek his humiliation? The man shot me a look, like I was supposed to rescue him. He found no help there. I asked Elliot out of curiosity, he said finally. I never touched a saw. I may have joked, but a joke is not a crime. Wolfe's eyelids drooped. Perhaps not. But jokes plant seeds. Someone watered yours. Tully left soon after, shaking with anger. When the door closed, Wolfe muttered, He is not the executioner, but he is the instigator. Another hand carried it out. That hand, Archie, we must locate. I had just poured myself a drink when the bell rang. Clara Dane stood there, pale and taut. She had a slip of paper in her hand, another note delivered that morning. This one read, The chair was only the beginning. Next will come the table where he feasts. She looked at me, then passed me to Wolfe, her voice almost breaking. They're not finished. They're escalating. And just like that, the air in the brownstone thickened, and I knew the case had taken a sharper turn. Whoever was after Raymond Dane had moved from sabotage to a promise of more. Wolfe's lips pressed thin, and he finally said, "So, the assailant moves from humiliation toward terror. Very well. Then we must tighten the circle." The slip of paper in Clara's hand trembled only slightly, but enough for Wolfe to notice. He gestured toward my desk, and I took the note to examine under the lamp. The type was the same, crooked letters, uneven pressure, the same clumsy machine grinding out threats like a bitter secretary. The wording, though, had shifted. The first note promised collapse. This one promised escalation, broadening the battlefield from a single chair to the table where Dane entertained his peers. Symbolism, Wolfe had said, and here it was swelling like a bruise turning darker. Delivered how? I asked. By post again, Clara said. This morning. Father hasn't seen it. I took it from the mail before he could. Wolfe's brows drew together. An interception, madam, is perilous. It leaves him uninformed and vulnerable. Her chin lifted. He would have dismissed it. At least this way you see it. At least someone takes it seriously. That was unarguable, though it made her shoulders stiffen with the guilt of deceiving her father. Wolfe let it pass. He leaned back, eyes closed, fingers interlaced. The author, he said, is not yet satisfied. The chair failed to achieve its full purpose. So now the table. The implication is direct. Public disgrace at a meal, perhaps poisoned, perhaps sabotaged. A warning crafted to instill dread before the act. I said, which means our friend wants Dane sweating bullets before the next dinner engagement. Has he got one scheduled? Clara nodded quickly. Tomorrow evening. A gathering at the club. Guests from the trade, city officials. He insisted on hosting despite what happened with the chair. Wolfe opened his eyes. Then the threat aligns with opportunity. Whoever seeks his undoing may attempt again at this dinner. I knew what was coming and didn't like it. Sure enough, Wolfe said, Archie, you will attend. Secure an invitation through Miss Dane. You will observe discreetly every hand that touches glass, every servant who hovers, every rival who smirks. Report immediately upon return. Clara agreed before I could groan. She promised she could add my name as a business acquaintance. When she left, Wolfe remained silent for several minutes, his lips moving faintly as if rehearsing silent syllogisms. Finally he spoke. The table is not only wood, it is fellowship, reputation. To ruin him there is to sever his standing. Therefore the assailant intends not merely injury, but annihilation of esteem. He opened his eyes at me. This is no casual malice, Archie. It is vengeance cultivated. The following evening, I pressed my only suit with enough starch to impress Park Avenue and arrived at the club. Clara, already there in a pale gown, gave me a quick nod from across the room. Dane sat at the head of the long table in a new chair, jaw tight as though daring wood and metal alike to betray him again. Around him clustered the city's importers and dignitaries, a noisy garden of ambition in tailored suits. I made my rounds quietly, ears open. Larkin was there, booming about his latest shipments. Vale lingered near the wine, smiling thinly at anyone who passed. Tully brooded 2 seats from Dane, nursing a glass with more bitterness than brandy. And at the far end, a man I recognized from Saul's notes, Peter Dross, whose firm Dane had undercut, sat watching, eyes darting like a jackal waiting for scraps. Dinner began. Platters arrived, glasses clinked, and the hum of conversation swelled. I stayed alert, eyes on the staff as much as the guests. The steward poured wine. The porter carried plates. Elliot, the handyman, was nowhere in sight. I kept circling the table, pretending to admire portraits on the wall, but every laugh and clink sharpened the tension. Dane ate sparingly, his eyes flicking once to Clara, who offered him a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Halfway through the main course, it happened. One of the crystal goblets set before Dane cracked down the stem with a sharp snap. Red wine spilled across the linen, seeping like blood. Gasps circled the table. Dane shoved back his chair, his face rigid. I was at his side instantly. The stem had sheared clean, too clean. I palmed the broken glass, ignoring the curious stares, and tucked it in my pocket handkerchief. Dane muttered something about shoddy crystal, but I saw the tightness in his jaw. He knew it wasn't accident. The dinner staggered on, though the gaiety had thinned. I watched carefully. Larkin gloating behind his napkin, Vale whispering with Dross, Tully scowling at Dane like an unpaid creditor. None gave themselves away, but the air had shifted. When it ended, Clara slipped me out a side door. Her hand shook on my arm. "You saw?" "That glass I saw," I said. "It was no accident. But you'll let Wolfe decide how much more it means." By the time I reached the brownstone and laid the goblet before Wolfe, his brows rose. He studied the break, then murmured, "Deliberate scoring with a blade. Designed to fail under stress. A second humiliation, less fatal but equally insidious." He leaned back, eyes narrowing. "Our adversary sharpens their cruelty. Very well. We shall sharpen our net." Wolfe set the shards of crystal down on a square of cloth, as if they were an ancient relic that deserved ceremony. He examined the stem, turning it with the tips of his fingers, and finally gave a grunt that meant he was satisfied the evidence spoke for itself. He didn't look at me when he said, "A chair, then a glass." "The method is consistent. Sabotage that appears as accident, timed for the presence of witnesses. The author is intent not on the life alone, but on the public ruin of Mr. Dane." "Which narrows it to about half the suspects," I said. "All four of them looked like they'd frame it and hang it on the wall." "Pfui, do not be fatuous. Larkin boasts, Vale sneers, Tully broods, Dross skulks. Their temperaments diverge, yet only one combines the patience for craftsmanship, the wit for taunt, and the appetite for spectacle. We must test each accordingly." He shifted his bulk in the chair, signaling he'd reached the stage of tactical deployment. "Archie, you will invite each of them here, singly, under pretext suitable to their vanity. I shall confront them in turn. That was Wolfe's idea of sport, parading suspects into his office like birds into a cage, then watching them flap while he clipped feathers with words. I started with Larkin the next day. He arrived booming with false cheer, slapped my shoulder hard enough to make me wish for hazard pay, and sat facing Wolfe like a man expecting applause. Wolfe let him roar for 5 minutes about trade conspiracies, before cutting him off with a single sentence. "Mr. Larkin, why did you wish to see Mr. Dane humiliated before his peers?" Larkin's mouth dropped. "Humiliated? The man's done that to himself for years. He didn't need me." He blustered, denied, cursed Dane's name, but under it all was nothing sharp enough to score crystal. Wolfe dismissed him with a wave, as though flicking away cigar smoke. Vale was next. She came sleek and cold, eyes flashing when she saw Wolfe's bulk filling the chair. "I should charge admission," she said, settling into the red seat. "People would pay to watch you conduct your little inquests." Wolfe ignored the bait. "The notes to Mr. Dane, did you compose them?" Her laugh was brittle. "I've written better lines in court filings. No, I didn't write them, and I wouldn't waste my energy sabotaging furniture. Dane's ruin is inevitable. He's a man rotting from his own pride." She meant it. But Wolfe noted every syllable before dismissing her. Tully came storming, already crimson at the collar, and it took less than 3 minutes for Wolfe to have him sweating. "You advised Elliot on carpentry," Wolfe said, calm as a judge. "You sowed the seed of a chair's collapse. Did you also direct the failure of glass?" "I never," Tully stammered, then thumped the armrest. "I might have joked, but I never told him to do it. You can't pin this on me." When Wolfe finally let him escape, the man was trembling, but I caught the flicker of guilt. Not the guilt of action, but of knowing too much and saying too little. The last was Peter Dross, who came reluctantly, his hat twisting in his hands. He was smaller than the others, his voice uncertain, but his eyes were bright with something too eager. Wolfe studied him as though weighing spices. "Mr. Dross," Wolfe said, "you have lost contract after contract to Mr. Dane. You have reason for spite. Did you also have reason for theatrics?" Dross shifted. I'm no good with tools. I couldn't saw a chair leg straight. And poetry isn't my trade." Wolfe leaned forward, the light catching his eyes. "Not tools, not poetry, but resentment, Mr. Dross, resentment so keen it craves a stage. You wished not his death in darkness, but his shaming in light. Did you not?" Dross flushed, denied, stammered, and finally begged to leave. Wolfe let him go, but his gaze lingered long after the door closed. When all four had paraded out, Wolfe shut his eyes and murmured, "Each denies. Each despises, but denial is hollow. We have enough now to constrict the net." He pressed the bell for Fritz's beer. "Archie, tomorrow evening we will summon them together. They will sit in that room, and the hand that struck at chair and glass will tremble when pressed. I poured myself a drink as Fritz delivered Wolfe's. And if none trembles? I asked. Wolfe sipped slowly, then let out a low sound like satisfaction. Then I shall provoke tremor. Pride is brittle, Archie, more brittle than crystal, and it fractures when struck at the proper angle. The following evening, the brownstone was prepared for the ritual Wolfe loves best, his office transformed into a stage. Every chair in place, the desk is thrown, and the red leather seats lined up for the audience of suspects. Fritz fussed over the rugs as though dust itself might sabotage the proceedings, while I double-checked that every invitation had been received and grudgingly accepted. Larkin promised to come to watch Wolfe make a fool of himself. Vale sent word she would indulge a curiosity. Tully barked he had no time for nonsense, but would attend anyway. And Dross wrote a short, nervous reply that reeked of eagerness, hidden under reluctance. Even Raymond Dane himself was persuaded, though not by Wolfe's charm. Clara had delivered the ultimatum that if he refused, she would never speak to him again. Pride can resist logic, but not filial leverage. By 8 o'clock they filed in one by one. Larkin, booming as usual, filled the room with his bulk and disdain. Vale glided in like a blade sheathed in silk. Tully looked half ready to burst from the collar, and Dross slipped in quietly, his eyes darting as if every book on Wolfe's shelves might whisper an accusation. Dane came last, grim and silent, Clara on his arm. Wolfe did not rise to greet them. He simply inclined his head and waited until all had settled, then began in his measured tones. Ladies and gentlemen, you are here because one among you has sought, through devices crude but effective, to humiliate Mr. Raymond Dane. A chair weakened to betray him, a glass prepared to shatter at his touch, notes typed with a poor machine, threatening further degradations. These are not accidents, nor are they coincidences. They are deliberate acts. The silence that followed was taut. I leaned against the wall, eyes flicking from face to face. Larkin smirked. Vale arched a brow. Tully shifted in his chair, and Dross swallowed hard. Dane sat rigid, jaw clenched, as if his presence were punishment enough. Wolfe continued, "The author of these acts seeks not only to unsettle Mr. Dane's person, but to erode his standing, to make him the object of scorn among peers. That is a particular ambition, one born not of mere rivalry but of injury cherished. I have spoken with each of you. All deny, yet denial is vapor. We shall now have substance." He gestured at me, and I produced the broken stem of the goblet wrapped in cloth. The glint of crystal caught the lamplight. Wolfe's voice dropped. This was not a flaw in manufacture. It was scored deliberately to fail at a moment chosen. A craftsman's hand made these cuts. A typewriter, battered and distinctive, made the notes. And opportunity. Here his gaze shifted to Dane, lay within the circle of those who had access to him at his club. The tension thickened. Vale spoke first, cool as winter. "You drag us here to accuse us of vandalizing glassware. Really, Mr. Wolfe, I expected more spectacle." Larkin barked a laugh. Here. If this is justice, I'll take the chair over the sermon." But Tully's face was slick with sweat, his hands gripping the arms of his seat. "Oh, you can't prove anything," he muttered. Wolfe's eyes opened a fraction wider, which in his world is the equivalent of fireworks. "No, Mr. Tully, I cannot prove that you wielded the saw, but I can prove that you inspired its use. You instructed Elliot, the handyman, in the art of weakening wood. You sowed the thought. You bear guilt, if not the full measure." Tully shot to his feet. "I only joked. I never told him to do it." His voice cracked. Larkin sneered. Vale rolled her eyes, and Dane looked at him with cold contempt. Wolfe lifted a hand. "Sit." The word carried the weight of iron. Tully dropped back, trembling. Wolfe turned slowly to the others. "But the hand that carried it out is another's, and that hand also delivered the notes and also marred the goblet. That hand belongs to one who wished not only to see Mr. Dane fall, but to watch him crumble under laughter." Every eye swung to Dross. His lips twitched. His fingers knotted, and suddenly he blurted, "I only wanted him to feel what he made me feel." The words hung there, stark and bare. Clara's breath caught. Dane stiffened, and Larkin let out a low whistle. Vale's smile widened with satisfaction. Wolfe inclined his head, as though the confession were nothing more than a point conceded in an argument. "Mr. Dross," Wolfe said softly, "you resented him for eclipsing you. You desired an audience for his downfall. You lacked the strength to strike openly. So you chose the coward's theatre, chairs, glasses, notes. A campaign of mockery disguised as fate. Pfui. Such malignancy is more vulgar than murder. Dross sank into his seat, muttering apologies no one believed. Dane's face hardened, but there was no triumph in it, only a weary disgust. Clara touched his arm, her eyes wet but steady. Wolfe leaned back, eyes closed once more, as if the affair had already passed into memory. The law may do as it wishes. My task is complete. Mr. Dane, your citadel still stands. Guard it more wisely. Guard it more wisely. The gathering broke like a wave against stone, each suspect spilling out into the night. Wolfe remained immovable, already signaling for beer. I knew he'd said all he meant to say. It was up to me to usher them out, clear the chairs, and close the door on the echo of humiliation that had filled the brownstone that night. When the last of them had gone, the brownstone sank back into its accustomed hush. Wolfe sat as though nothing had happened, eyes closed, fingertips resting lightly on his middle. The picture of a man who had spent an hour directing traffic instead of dismantling egos. I closed the front door behind Vale's perfume and Larkin's thunder, then came back into the office, where Clara still lingered with her father. Raymond Dane had not spoken since Dross's outburst. He sat stiff in the red chair, his face a mask carved out of granite. Clara leaned toward him, her hand on his arm, whispering something I couldn't catch. He finally rose, tugging at his coat with a sharp jerk, and addressed Wolfe with a formality that dripped ice. You've had your entertainment, Mr. Wolfe. You've shamed a pitiful man and given my enemies a night to gossip about. But you've done nothing for me. Wolfe opened his eyes just enough to show they were not amused. On the contrary, sir. I have preserved you from further petty indignities. Your adversary has been exposed, your circle of suspicion clarified. You may now attend your table without fear of collapse or splinter. What more do you wish? Applause? Dane's nostrils flared, but Clara spoke quickly before he could spit fire. Father, listen. You saw what he did. You heard him confess. Mr. Wolfe stopped it before it went further. Further? Dane snapped. A sword, chair, and a cracked glass. Childish pranks. I would have endured them without this circus. He turned on his heel and strode to the door, pausing only to say, Good evening, Mr. Wolfe. My daughter may think she owes you gratitude. I do not. Then he was gone, the front door slamming a punctuation mark behind him. Clara lingered, her expression tight with apology. Please don't think his words mean anything. He cannot bear to admit weakness. I thank you, truly. At least now I can breathe. She pressed my hand, managed a smile, and followed her father into the night. When the door closed again, I looked at Wolfe. He was scowling, though in his case a scowl is just a slightly deeper fold of flesh above the nose. Well, I said, that was gratitude served cold. He is a fool, Wolfe muttered. A man more enraged at the exposure of his enemy than relieved by it. Pride such as his is impervious even to rescue. He sighed, signaled for beer, and the ritual resumed. I poured him a glass, then one for myself. So that's it? Dross folds, Dane fumes, and we file it under resolved? Wolfe took a long swallow before answering. Dross will be dealt with by the law. Tully will live with his guilt. Larkin and Vale will sharpen their knives in other ways. Mr. Dane will continue to sit, bluster and alienate. It is finished. I leaned back in my chair, letting the quiet settle. Finished, yes, but not neat. Dross had confessed, but the venom in his words lingered like smoke. He had wanted Dane broken in front of witnesses, and he had nearly succeeded. Dane's pride might keep him upright, but pride doesn't make a man bulletproof. And I couldn't help wondering how long before another enemy took a different approach. The evening wound down as Fritz brought in the tray, cheese, bread, and a touch of ham for Wolfe's late snack. My boss ate with his usual deliberation, pausing once to deliver what for him amounted to reflection. Archie, he said, eyes half-lidded, man's appetite for humiliation is greater than his appetite for blood. To kill is simple. To unseat, to disgrace, to make a man doubt the chair beneath him, that is a cruelty more refined, more enduring. Remember that. I nodded, though I was already scribbling the line in my head, knowing it would make a neat finish when I wrote the record of the case. Wolfe went back to his cheese, content, while I leaned back and let the quiet fill the brownstone again. Outside, the city went on grinding its gears. Chairs kept their balance, glasses held their wine, and Nero Wolfe, master of logic and appetite alike, sat immovable in his own, and that, as far as the record shows, is how the chair that cradled the victim never claimed him, though it came close, and how Wolfe proved once again that he could topple an enemy without moving an inch. The brownstone had returned to its usual rhythm, quiet, orderly, everything in its place. But I've learned that when Wolfe calls a case finished, it doesn't always mean the world agrees. 3 nights later, I was at my desk, typing up notes for the record when the phone rang. Clara Dane's voice came through the receiver, strained and fast. "Mr. Goodwin, please, something's happened. My father collapsed at the club tonight. Not an accident. Not illness, poison. He's alive, but the doctors say it was deliberate. He insists it was food, not drink, but—" Her voice caught. I didn't know who else to call. I told her to sit tight and hung up. Wolfe was in the kitchen, haranguing Fritz about the balance of herbs in the soup. But when I delivered the news, the soup was forgotten. He lumbered into the office, settled in his chair, and stared at me as though weighing whether to curse fate or gloat at having been proven right about Dane's peril. "Pfui," he said finally. "Humiliation has escalated into harm. I predicted refinement. Instead, we have coarseness. Poison is vulgar, crude, unless—" He let the thought trail while his eyes closed. "Archie, we must discern whether this is the same hand, emboldened, or another seizing opportunity. Go to the club, speak with the steward, the physician, anyone who touched his plate. Bring me particulars." So I went. The club was buzzing like a hive that had been kicked. Members whispered in corners, staff scurried, and the steward met me with a face pale as bleached linen. He confirmed Dane had eaten roast pheasant, same as half the table, but only his portion showed traces of a bitter almond odor. The doctor had acted quickly, pumping him, and Dane was expected to survive. I asked about access. The steward shook his head. Only the kitchen staff handled the plates. No outsiders, but there was a delivery earlier today. A private basket addressed to Mr. Dane. Fruit, wine, a jar of spice. We assumed it was for his household. It was left in the pantry until after dinner. That detail stuck. I asked to see the remains. He led me to the pantry, where a wicker basket sat half-emptied, tissue paper crumpled around bottles and jars. I lifted the jar of spice. It was cinnamon, the seal already broken. The steward swore no one had touched it, except one of the kitchen boys, who'd sprinkled some into a sauce at Dane's request. I pocketed the jar and headed back to the brownstone. Wolfe took it in his hands like a relic. He sniffed once, grimaced, and barked, "Bitter almonds, cyanide." He set it down with contempt. "So, our saboteur escalates not to terrify, but to destroy. Dross confessed to humiliation, not death. This is another hand." I sat, lit a cigarette, and said, "Then Dane has more enemies than he has chairs. Which one graduated from sawdust to poison?" Wolfe didn't answer immediately. He closed his eyes, his lips pursed, the great bulk of him immovable except for the faint twitch of fingers. Finally, we summoned them again. Not for confrontation this time, but for elimination. The jar, the basket, the delivery, these will reveal who seeks not shame but silence. I couldn't help a grin. "You mean to bait them into betraying themselves?" His eyes opened, heavy and certain. "Precisely. Whoever arranged this basket will betray knowledge they should not have. Words, expressions, denials, they will suffice. And when they do, Archie, we shall make plain that to tamper with food in my city is an abomination I will not abide." He reached for the bell to summon Fritz, then paused, fixing me with that cold glint he saves for his rare moments of personal emphasis. "Archie, tell Miss Dane her father's life now hangs not on medicine, but on whether she persuades him to cooperate fully. If he resists again, he will die not from poison but from arrogance." That was Wolfe's verdict, hard as granite. I knew it meant the game wasn't over, only sharpened. Dane had escaped the chair and the glass, but someone out there wasn't content with humiliation anymore. Someone wanted him gone, and Wolfe, planted firmly in his chair, was preparing to drag them into the light. The summons went out again, and if the first gathering had been tense, this second one carried the air of a tribunal. They came reluctantly, each suspect with a face that told its own story. Larkin wore belligerence like a badge. Vale arrived with her smile sharpened to a knife edge. Tully looked hunted and heavy, and Dross, pale, jittery, already condemned in spirit, slipped in as though hoping the walls would swallow him. Clara accompanied her father this time, guiding him into the room as if he were a reluctant witness instead of the intended victim. Dane himself looked gaunter, the brush with poison having shaved a layer of bluster off him, but his pride still stood taller than his shoulders. Wolfe wasted no time. The jar of cinnamon, sealed in a glass vial, sat on his desk like an exhibit. He gestured toward it with one finger. "This, gentleman and lady, is the vehicle by which Mr. Dane was nearly killed. Cyanide was mingled with spice and delivered to his table in a basket. The attempt was crude but effective enough to bring him to the brink." There was a stir. Vale's brow arched. Larkin muttered something under his breath. Tully flinched, and Ross's eyes locked on the jar as though it might leap at him. Wolfe went on, his voice even. "I tell you this not to alarm, but to observe. One among you arranged that delivery. One among you escalated from humiliation to murder, and that hand shall betray itself." He leaned back, fingers interlaced, and let the silence stretch until it threatened to snap. Then he turned his gaze to Vale. "You, madam, litigated against Mr. Dane. You lost, and you despise him. Would you also poison him?" Her laugh was cold. "I am a lawyer, not a cook. My weapons are words, not powders. If I wished Dane destroyed, it would be through contracts and courtrooms. This," she gestured at the jar, "is beneath me." "Indeed," Wolfe said, and moved on. His eyes shifted to Larkin. "You roar loudest of all, Mr. Larkin. Would you quiet Dane with spice?" Larkin snorted. "If I wanted him gone, I'd outbid him until he drowned in debt. Poison? I don't hide behind cinnamon jars. I like my victories public." Wolfe let the sound linger, then fixed on Tully. "You advised sabotage before. Did you also advise this?" Tully's face turned crimson. "No, I said too much once, yes, but I'd never go so far." "Poison? That's monstrous. I wouldn't dare." Wolfe's lips twitched in a gesture that might have been disdain. Finally, his gaze landed on Dross. "And you, Mr. Dross, you confessed to seeking humiliation. The chair, the glass, those were yours. Did you also hunger for his life?" Dross's mouth opened, then closed. His eyes darted from the jar to Dane to Wolfe, and sweat beaded on his forehead. "No," he said, barely above a whisper. "I wanted him broken, not dead. I never touched." "That?" Clara leaned forward, her hand gripping the arm of her father's chair. "Then who?" she demanded. "If not him, then who? Someone must answer." Wolfe raised a hand, silencing her. His eyes had been half-lidded, but now they opened, sharp and alive. "Precisely. Someone must answer. And they have." Every head turned. Wolfe pointed. Not at Dross, not at Tully, but at Dane himself. His voice was calm, almost weary. "You, sir." The room erupted. Clara gasped. Larkin cursed, Vale laughed outright, and Tully choked. Dane surged to his feet, his face blazing. "Outrageous!" "You dare—" "Sit," Wolfe commanded, his voice like stone. And incredibly, Dane obeyed, collapsing back into the chair as though the weight of Wolfe's certainty pressed him down. "You arranged the basket," Wolfe said, tone flat as fact. "Not to kill yourself, but to bolster your pride. The earlier humiliations wounded you. You could not bear to be seen merely the victim of sabotage, so you sought to dramatize it further. Poison, discovered in time, would render you not a fool but a martyr. You overreached, however. The dose was too high, the risk too real. Pride nearly destroyed you." Clara's eyes widened, her lips trembling. "Father, is that true?" Dane's fists clenched, but his silence condemned him more than words. Wolfe closed his eyes again, as though weary of human folly. "A man so enslaved to dignity will sacrifice even his safety to preserve it. Pfui. You deserve neither pity nor praise, but you are exposed. If you persist, you will die by your own vanity, not another's malice." The silence that followed was crushing. Finally, Dane rose, his face grey, and without a word left the room. Clara followed, her steps slow, torn between fury and sorrow. The others sat stunned, each measuring what they had seen. Wolfe finally waved a hand, dismissing them all. When the last door closed, I let out the breath I'd been holding. "So the big villain of the piece is the victim himself." "That's a new one," Wolfe grunted, reaching for his beer. "Man requires little help to destroy himself, Archie. The enemy within is always the most efficient, and with that the brownstone reclaimed its silence, leaving me with the task of writing a record that no one outside these walls would believe. For the next day and a half the brownstone held its breath, waiting for fallout. I kept expecting the phone to ring with reporters, sniffing out scandal, or police asking Wolfe to explain why Raymond Dane had practically been put on trial in our office. But the phone stayed silent, and the only interruptions were Fritz carrying trays and Wolfe dictating letters that had nothing to do with chairs, glasses, or poisoned spices. Outwardly, it looked as if the case had slipped into the past, tucked neatly in Wolfe's vault of solved affairs. But I knew better. He was still chewing silently, and when Wolfe chews in silence, it's never just dinner. It was Clara who broke the lull. She arrived unannounced in the late afternoon, pale but steady, her eyes showing the fatigue of someone who hadn't slept since the confrontation. She came alone, which told me plenty. Dane hadn't forgiven, and he hadn't accompanied her. She walked straight to Wolfe without hesitation, and for once he didn't scold her for entering without invitation. She faced him with a courage that made me revise my estimate of her. "My father refuses to admit it," she said quietly. "He tells me I'm imagining things. He insists he never arranged that basket, never risked his life. He says you humiliated him more than anyone else could have." Her voice broke, but she steadied it. "I don't know if I believe him. I only know he's angry. At me, at you, at himself, at everything." Wolfe shifted, a slow rearrangement of mass that meant he was giving the matter its due gravity. "Miss Dane," he said, "your father's pride is a fortress built on sand. When the tide of humiliation reached him, he sought to control it by enlarging it. That is my deduction. Whether he confesses or denies alters nothing. The facts remain." She pressed her lips together, nodded once, and then asked the question that hung in the air like smoke. "What happens now?" "Nothing," Wolfe said. "If he persists in denial, he will live in denial. If he chooses contrition, that is his affair. The law will not pursue him. No evidence will withstand scrutiny. His enemies will gossip, but gossip soon shifts its gaze. He has been spared death, if not disgrace. That suffices." It sounded cold, but then again Wolfe wasn't in the business of patching souls. Clara thanked him anyway, softly, and left. I watched her go, feeling a tug I couldn't quite name. When the door shut, I turned to Wolfe. "So that's it? We let him stew in his own juice while Clara bears the brunt of it?" Wolfe's eyes narrowed. "Archie, to intervene further would be presumption. The man's flaw is immutable. We do not mend character. We expose it." That is all. I poured myself a drink, still not convinced. There was something unfinished about it, a jagged edge left untucked. But Wolfe had already closed his eyes, sinking back into his chair as if sealing the matter off from oxygen. He was done, which meant I had to be too, whether I liked it or not. That evening, Fritz prepared a dinner Wolfe considered worth the day's patience. Pheasant, ironic as it was, but roasted without sabotage and spiced without cyanide. Over the table, Wolfe offered one last morsel, the kind he saves for dessert. "Archie," he said, "murder is crude, but humiliation endures. Yet there is a limit. A man who seeks to master his disgrace by contriving it only magnifies it. That is the true folly of Mr. Dane. Remember it when you record this. Posterity should not miss the lesson." I nodded, jotting the line down later for my report. Outside, the city clattered on, oblivious to the pride and poisons of one stubborn importer. Inside, the brownstone settled again into silence, the orchids upstairs breathing their perfumed air. Wolfe in his chair, me at my desk. The case of the chair that cradled the victim had reached its end. Not with a bang, not even with applause, but with the soft, inevitable collapse of a man's vanity under its own weight. And that, I thought as I turned off the light, was justice of a kind Wolfe respected most, not the kind written in law books, but the kind written in the stubborn ledger of human folly. The weeks that followed trickled by without further alarms, though the case lingered like the aftertaste of something bitter. Dane withdrew from the spotlight, trimming his appearances at the club to a bare minimum. Word drifted back through the grapevine that he'd tightened his circle, shed a few partnerships, and carried himself with even more stiffness than before. His rivals took satisfaction in whispering, but no one dared another open strike. The spectacle had been enough. Clara visited once more, alone with a calm I hadn't seen on her before. She thanked Wolfe again, though she admitted her father would never utter the words. She didn't ask for advice. She seemed to know there was none Wolfe would offer beyond what he'd already said. When she left, it felt final, like the last page of a chapter that had been forced shut. Life at the brownstone slid back into its grooves. Wolfe retreated to his orchids with renewed devotion, as if the affair had left him hungry for silence. Fritz found comfort in his kitchen, perhaps relieved that no one had tainted the spices he revered. As for me, I caught myself thinking more than once about Clara's face that night, when Wolfe accused her father. The raw collision of love, betrayal, and disbelief. Cases leave marks, and that was the one this left on me. One evening, as Fritz served a trout so delicate it almost glowed, Wolfe spoke without preamble. "Archie, there is no spectacle so pitiful as a man trying to script his own downfall. To seek dignity by manufacturing disgrace, it is the ultimate folly." He took a deliberate forkful and chewed in silence before adding, "The world will never lack for those who destroy themselves in the name of pride. They require no saboteur but themselves." I lifted my glass. "Then I suppose our work will never dry up." He gave me a look that was half scorn, half amusement. "It would not dry up even if men were sensible. There would still be vanity, greed, envy. Orchids may be cultivated. Men never." That was as close to philosophy as Wolfe cared to venture, and it was enough. I let the quiet settle, hearing the city hum faintly through the window. Another case closed, another record for the files, another reminder that justice doesn't always wear the shape we want. Sometimes it means putting a mirror in a man's hands and forcing him to see what he is. And so the brownstone held steady again, its rhythms intact. Wolfe in his chair, me at my desk, Fritz in his kitchen, orchids upstairs, the city outside, all as it had been, all as it would be. The chair that cradled the victim had not claimed him, but it had revealed him, and in Wolfe's ledger that was justice enough. I closed the book on it with one final note to myself. People may break chairs, crack glass, even taint spice, but sooner or later it's always pride that brings a man down. Wolfe would never say it quite that way, but I think he'd agree.